Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lunch with California Common Cause. I'm Jonathan Mehta Stein, the Executive Director at California Common Cause. This is our weekly opportunity to connect with our members and others dedicated to building a better and more inclusive democracy. We were off last week unexpectedly. We didn't tell anybody. We just didn't do this because everyone was so knocked out from Election Day. 1 week ago today was the day after the election, and everyone was recovering. But we're glad to be with you today to share some reflections on the election and to share the results of our massive election protection program where we had poll monitor volunteers all over Southern California. I want to say thank you and God bless for enduring this incredibly strenuous and what felt like never-ending election season. You made it. We're on the other side now. We still have some lingering issues, of course, and I'll address those later. But I just want to say you did it, and we're ready to sort of tackle issues going forward. So I want to talk about our poll monitoring program first, and then I'll talk about the remaining issues in this election and our agenda going forward. I'm also going to share some legislative or regulatory advocacy we may be doing in 2021, given what we saw on Election Day. Let me just take a note here. Great. Okay, so our poll monitoring program spanned 3 days, the Saturday and Monday before Election Day during the early vote period and on Election Day. We had over 400 volunteers. We had about 100 in the field on Saturday, 100 in the field on Monday, and over 400 in the field on Tuesday. We went to over 1,200 voting locations, and we did over 1,700 visits. That's the difference in those two numbers is because some poll monitors went to certain sites more than once. They went once in the early voting period and then once on Election Day, or they went multiple times on Election Day if they saw problems and wanted to get updates. We had 139 intakes at our headquarters. So every single time a poll monitor visited a voting site, they submitted a checklist, either an electronic checklist or a paper checklist. And so I said earlier, we had over 1,700 visits. That means our staff has over 1,700 checklists to dig through and to analyze. But we had 139 intakes and escalations. That is, significant problems identified in the field by our poll monitors who called it into our headquarters, which we then triaged, evaluated, and addressed by escalating to someone in a position of authority. So that gives you some scale of the rate at which we identified problems. So what were the major takeaways from our poll monitoring effort? I'll say one, there were two really unexpected and really major benefits to this transition to a new system. So essentially California moved, most counties in California, not the entire state, but most counties, including the 5 big counties in which we were poll monitoring in this election cycle, LA, Orange, San Diego, San Bernardino, and Riverside, they all moved to a light version or the real version of the Voters' Choice Act. The Voters' Choice Act was a law passed in 2016. It was implemented in 5 counties in 2018, moved to a much, much wider range of counties in 2020. And may become the dominant voting system in the state in the years to come. But essentially, it's a system in which everyone gets a vote by mail ballot, and the county gets to dramatically reduce the number of voting sites. But every voting site it does have has to be larger, has to offer more services, has to be open for early voting, and has to offer location flexibility. That is, any voter can go into any site anywhere in the county, and they can get their ballot and vote. We essentially moved to that model because it provided the greatest flexibility for voters and also gave every voter an opportunity to vote by mail or vote by drop box, which is another key element of the Voters' Choice Act in a COVID environment. And so the Voters' Choice Act was sort of a pre-existing model that we threw on across the state to react to COVID. 2 unexpected benefits. First, that location flexibility that allows a voter to go into any voting site anywhere in their county. Turns out it's really important in moments of crisis. If there's a fire, for example, and those feel like a never-ending part of life in California now, or if there's a pandemic, for example, people who are displaced under the Voters' Choice Act don't have to travel back to wherever it is they used to live or to a home that has been destroyed. They have the opportunity to vote at any site in the county. And so the Voters' Choice Act is really actually well prepared to handle voting amid an emergency. which feels like kind of the new normal. Also, another unexpected benefit of the Voters' Choice Act and this new model we used in 2020 was that we had we had a very widespread early voting period. Most California counties offered a voting period that was 4 days or even longer. What that meant was that a number of issues that ordinarily would emerge on the morning of Election Day actually emerged on the Saturday morning before Election Day. We saw this in Riverside County. I'm going to talk about some specific issues we encountered and were able to address in our poll monitoring program in just a minute. But Riverside County had really significant tech issues on at the beginning of the voting period. Well, that meant that voting was really impacted in Riverside County on Saturday morning, but that's a lower stake and environment with lower voter traffic to address tech issues or other problems as opposed to the morning of Election Day. If we had been running a standard process for this election, all of those issues would have piled up on the morning of Election Day, and election morning would have been a bit of a disaster. I will say I've run poll monitoring programs for many election cycles. This was my 6th poll monitoring program, and ordinarily on the morning of Election Day at 7 a.m. when polls open, all of the phones start ringing at headquarters, and they ring nonstop for an hour or more. And this was actually a relatively slow election day morning for us. And I think the reason why is because a lot of the issues had been ironed out in lower stakes environments during Saturday and Sunday. The last thing that we saw, sort of major takeaway, was that electioneering and behavior by campaign supporters was much more aggressive in 2020 than we've ever seen it before. Every once in a while, you'll see an isolated case of electioneering in California in which someone is being too aggressive in campaigning for a candidate or campaigning for a ballot measure close to an election site, or they wear a shirt or a hat representing a campaign into the voting site when they go vote. We saw a whole nother level of that stuff in 2020. We saw, rallies, truck rallies, and other boisterous behavior by supporters that may have felt threatening or intimidating to some voters or blocked access to voting sites. We saw it all over Southern California. I'm going to talk a little bit about specifics in just a minute. That was behavior we had not really seen in the past. And also voters who wore campaign shirts or campaign hats into voting sites to go vote and refused to follow poll worker directions when they were told that that was electioneering and not permitted by California law. Ordinarily, in the past, voters grumble, but they take off the shirt, or they turn it inside out, or they take off the hat, or they do whatever, and they comply with the law. And this time around, it simply just was not the case. I'll talk more about some specifics in an instance. And so we have some work to do, sort of fine-tuning our definition of electioneering and making sure that voters feel safe and protected and able to cast a vote free from influence when they're in that sanctified space of the voting site. Okay, so what are some specific instances of things we saw? Well, I alluded to this earlier, but on Saturday morning, Riverside County experienced severe slowdowns with their check-in process. They had a number of problems that appeared to compound themselves. One was that some voting sites had been given the wrong password to log into their machines, what led to a pileup of voters on Saturday morning. Other sites had a problem with their printers where they weren't able to, once they've checked people in, they weren't able to print out what they needed in order to get that vote or their ballot. And then a widespread number of counties had problems with the check-in process. So in Riverside County, when you checked in with a poll worker staffing a laptop, they typed in your information in order to find you and find your ballot type. And that process was slowed or even stopped in some Riverside County sites. And this is one thing, this is another major takeaway, that we are moving to a modernized election system in California that offers more services. For example, it offers same-day voter registration, or that location flexibility I talked about earlier. That takes technology that is more advanced than our old systems. In the past, we used big paper rosters with big paper pages listing every single voter at that voting site. And literally, when someone checked in, a poll worker would cross their name out with a long stroke of the pen. And people voted on paper ballots. And that limited the services we could offer voters. Now, modernizing our voting systems and adding new technology just creates the possibility of tech issues. And Riverside County got hit really hard on Saturday morning. It led to a slowdown of voting in a lot of sites, and in some cases, voting actually stopped, which is something that very, very rarely happens. Another instance on Saturday was a rally in support of President Trump in San Bernardino County that was so massive and was circling voting sites so that it was actually blocking access to voting sites. And we had to send a volunteer out there to document and to make sure that voters could actually access voting sites and were not having their path of travel impeded by the Trump rally. So a concrete example of what I was mentioning earlier about really aggressive electioneering behavior close to voting sites. Another one of those came on Tuesday in San Clemente at a voting site at the San Clemente outlets. There were a number of voters who showed up wearing Trump gear, and they simply refused to take it off. And in fact, when they asked politely by the poll workers to take off the Trump gear because it violated the state's law around electioneering, it made them more adamant they were going to wear it. And they started talking about their First Amendment rights and so on. And word appeared to, we can't confirm this, but word appeared to get out that this was going on among supporters of the president, and more people showed up wearing Trump gear, and the poll workers were sort of unable to control the scene. Another example of the more aggressive electioneering we saw in 2020 that we don't typically see. I want to compliment our poll monitor who stayed there for hours to make sure that the situation didn't impede voting or didn't intimidate any voters, didn't make anyone feel uncomfortable. We called it into the county elections office. The county elections office called the poll workers to say, you have to take action in order to address this. This is a violation of state law and so on. So I was proud of our operation in that instance. A couple really, here's another small one. Well, no, I'll skip that one. I'll go to two bigger things. One was something we got covered in the news quite a bit in Westminster. This is a second Orange County issue on Tuesday. There was a fake voting location created by a number of local campaigns. It was the office of a person running for office, and they put up bunting and tents and what looked like ballot boxes and a sign in Vietnamese that appeared to call it a voting site. And they were publicizing it as a voting site in Vietnamese and in English on social media and local programs. We were really concerned that it was misleading voters who thought they were voting at an actual site. And now, if they're simply collecting ballots, that's actually permitted by California's third-party ballot collection law. And if they were helping people, let's say Vietnamese speakers, get assistance in a language of the voter's choice, that's all fine. But if they were actually influencing anyone on how to vote, that's a deep problem. And having a quote-unquote fake voting site at a candidate's office certainly gives rise to that possibility and the appearance of impropriety. Also, the fact that it was misleading people and potentially misleading limited English-speaking voters about the fact that it was not a real voting site is deeply problematic. A number of people activated on this. The Secretary of State's office was aware of it. The AG's office was aware of it. The district attorney in Orange County was aware of it. We ended up sending a volunteer because all of those authorities didn't actually really take action. I don't feel like they felt like they had some sort of actionable means to shut the site down. And so we sent volunteers there to tell voters, you're welcome to go in, but if you want an actual official drop box, there's one that's a half a mile away. If you want an actual official voting site, there's one that's roughly a half a mile away. We also had a champion volunteer, who was willing to go dumpster diving in the back of the site to see if they were throwing out ballots or from supporters of one particular candidate or whatever. And really went the extra mile. So again, I want to compliment our volunteers for the work that they did. And then the last of the specifics that I'll get into, really, really, really long lines in Riverside County on Election Day. They popped up immediately. Our volunteers noticed them within the first few minutes of voting in the morning. Lines quickly emerged that were half an hour, 45 minutes long. Those lines continued into the afternoon, same length or longer, hitting an hour long in some instances. And the problems exploded in the evening as we got to the close of polls. The same voting sites that had problems all day now had lines that were 90 minutes or 2 hours, and then new sites that had not had problems ended up having voting lines that were an hour, 2 hours, in one instance, 3 hours. And there was a multitude of problems. But again, I think it had to do with technology. So the county elections office, who we were in regular communication with on Election Day, claimed that the problem was caused by not having enough ballot marking devices that are, that's the new name for voting machines. And so they were rushing more voting machines out to the sites that had the long lines. But our poll monitors observed the problem. Actually, the choke point was actually the check-in process. Riverside County has, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, a sort of an older or less high-tech check-in process than some of their neighbors in LA and Orange County. And the check-in process took much longer, and they didn't have enough check-in points. And voters who needed to use a same-day voter registration had a lengthy process in Riverside. And in a lot of instances, poll workers had to call the county elections office with each voter's information to understand, to finalize their information and to understand what precinct they voted in so they could give the right ballot to that person. Those problems all piled up and got really bad by election night. And so you had voters waiting in the dark and in the cold for hours. And our poll monitors, again, champion poll monitors, a lot of them stayed on site to make sure that everyone who was in line at 8 p.m. was able to cast their ballot, even if it was 9 p.m. or 10 p.m., and making sure that voters weren't discouraged by the situation. So I will say that coming up, we have a bunch of work to do on our hands. We will take all the data that we've collected from our 1,700 visits to voting sites. We will do an analysis by county to identify where the county succeeded and where it can have improvement. And then we're going to put together a full-on report, a report from all of our work across all of our 5 counties. We did a report in 2018 because that was an election in which the Voters' Choice Act was being rolled out for the very first time. And we did a report in March of 2020, focused primarily on our poll monitoring in LA County, where there was really substantial problems with the rollout of, again, new technology. And which led to really long lines across LA County. So if you're interested in reading our past reports, you can go on our website and you can find them, the 2018 report and the March 2020 report. We will be putting together a November 2020 report. So we've got months of work ahead, and you can read that report when it comes out. I will say that we also learned there are some issues, legislative and regulatory issues that we need to address in 2021 together with our partners. So for example, there's a lot of electioneering activity that happened around drop boxes. The law is really clear. You cannot do electioneering. You cannot be sort of boisterously campaigning for a particular candidate or campaign within 100 feet of a voting site. It's a little bit less clear around drop boxes. So we have to re-examine what's allowed around a drop box to make sure that people can access their drop boxes. What do you do if a rally or a truck caravan, for example, is blocking access to a voting site? It's more than 100 feet away, and so it's not electioneering. It's not really intimidating people, which would be illegal under California law. There appears to be this sort of this loophole that emerged that it's not really clear what to do in the event that the rally or a caravan of some kind is blocking access temporarily or semi-permanently to voting sites for voters. And what if they're blocking one road when there's 3 available? What if there's only one road and they're blocking it? What do we do in those situations? That's something we're going to have to take a look at as we talk to other advocates and prepare for 2021. Can we allow counties to extend voting hours unilaterally? So right now, the only thing that can allow for the extension of voting hours in California is an executive order from the governor or a court order. But would it have behooved Riverside County to hold their voting open for another hour? Yes, everyone who's in line by 8 p.m. gets to vote, even if it's at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. But the presence of long lines all day may have deterred people who came earlier and realized, I don't have 2 hours to wait in line here. I have a job to get back to, or I have childcare to attend to. I can come back after 8 p.m. when my job is over or my childcare is not as urgent. But you can't come back after 8 p.m. And should counties be able to unilaterally extend their voting hours? What about drop box tampering, right? We have been told that drop boxes in California were tamper-proof and that it wasn't possible to, for example, set a fire inside of a drop box. They're supposed to be made such that there's very little to no oxygen inside, and so a fire can't burn. And yet in the community, a predominantly African-American community, Baldwin Park in LA, someone did set fire to the contents of a drop box and damaged something like 20 ballots. Do we need to take another look at the regulations around ballot drop boxes? These are all things that we'll be looking at with our partners, because Common Cause is dedicated to building a better democracy and dedicated to building better elections in California year in and year out. And we can often do more legislative and regulatory advocacy in an off year where there's no election because we have more resources and more time. Okay, I want to give people a short update or just a very quick thought on the incredible amount of litigation that the Trump administration is putting forward into the world. The reality of the situation is that none of that litigation it should result in a change in election outcomes. First and foremost, the lawsuits are being quickly tossed out of court because there's no basis for them. They're alleging things based on rumor or hearsay. There's no concrete evidence of substantial voter fraud in any of the states. Even if they were to be able, in Pennsylvania, for example, they're claiming that votes that came in after Election Day shouldn't count. But the fact of the matter is that it appears that President-elect Joe Biden has won Pennsylvania, even not counting the votes that came in after Election Day. Now, those votes absolutely should count. For the record, the reason why votes couldn't be processed earlier, right? So even with the votes that came in on and by Election Day, it seems clear that Biden has won Pennsylvania, and so that lawsuit is not going to change the outcome. But even if one of these lawsuits, in the incredibly remote chance that it changed the outcome on one swing state, the fact of the matter is that Biden has, it appears, won a healthy electoral college victory, and swinging one of these states, which again I find incredibly unlikely, is not going to change the outcome of the election. I think a lot of what's happening here is that this is an attempt to placate the president and the president's base. I think a lot of the Republicans who are supporting the president and refuse to acknowledge that Joe Biden has won this election are doing so to placate the president, who will be a power center in the Republican Party and will control his base for years to come. And you don't want to anger the person who will remain the most powerful person on the GOP side of American politics. Take, for example, the two senators in Georgia who are running for re-election and claiming that the Georgia election was wrongly decided and attacking a Republican Secretary of State for his handling of the election. That Republican Secretary of State, for the record, is claiming that the vote proceeded as normal and everything is in order. But they are hoping that President Trump will hold rallies in Georgia and will tweet about their campaign, help do turnout for their campaign. And so they're carrying water for the president on his claims that Georgia was wrongly decided, despite a lack of evidence, I think simply to stay in the president's good graces. I think that there is more politics happening here than any sort of real legal action. And I think that we should just keep repeating that the vote count is secure, the vote count is accurate. County elections officials do an exemplary job. There may be some individual cases of fraud, but the people spoke and the decision was made by the American public. Okay, a couple other things. One, our voter outreach is not quite over. We ended up contacting we ended up sending 1.4 million text messages in California with good, reliable, nonpartisan information about how to cast your ballot. We targeted folks who had not used vote-by-mail ballots in the past and explaining how they could use that vote-by-mail ballot. We contacted an additional 250,000 people via letter. And FYI, that Common Cause sent 15 million texts across the United States. But our work is not done, because California voters sometimes have their vote-by-mail ballots disqualified because of a signature issue. They forget to sign their vote-by-mail ballot, or their signature doesn't match. And in that instance, voters have the opportunity to go into their county elections office to sign an affidavit and to cure the problem. That's the term, cure the problem. And so we're going to try to text every single California voter who is in that position to give them a heads up and to make sure that they know they can go in and cure their ballot. So our work, our voter outreach work, continues here into November, into the body of November. And then our work continues on all of our other priorities. We have been obsessed with the election here at California Common Cause, as I'm sure you have for the last many months. But we work on redistricting, we work on money in politics, we work on a variety of other programs, and that is all going to come back to the fore in 2021. Redistricting is upon us. Census was a massive civic engagement project. The election was a massive civic engagement project, and redistricting is the next massive civic engagement project. How lines are drawn at the local and state level will determine who can access power, what communities feel represented, and so on. And we want to fight for redistricting processes that are as independent as possible, as fair as possible, as inclusive as possible, and as accessible as possible. So we'll be doing that advocacy at the state level and at the local level, with a particular emphasis on jurisdictions that have independent commissions, like the City of San Diego, the County of San Diego, the County of Los Angeles, County of Santa Barbara, Oakland, Sacramento, and then also Berkeley, and then also cities where we're continuing to advocate for independent commissions, for example, Sunnyvale and Menlo Park. So that's our work. You can stay with us in the next era of Common Cause as we do our work on redistricting money politics, where we continue our student programming, training the next generation of student leaders. Visit us at commoncause.org/CA, and you can sign up for our emails and stay updated on our work. Of course, you can always watch our Facebook Lives Wednesdays at 12 noon. We may move to every other week now that the election's behind us. And we can update people on our work in these areas like redistricting, like money in politics, like our student programs, but not give super regular updates on our elections work. And of course, you can always follow us on social media. On Twitter, we're at Common Cause CA. On Instagram, we're at CA Common Cause. And on Facebook, we're at facebook.com/Common Cause CA. Thank you so much for being with us through all of election season and through all of 2020. We hope you enjoyed our weekly live streams. They will continue in some way, shape, or form as we head into the next era of our work. Thank you for being in the fight with us here at California Common Cause. As always, we deeply appreciate your support. Thanks and take care.